Daniel was brought to the king. I have found a man of the children of the captivity of Judah, that will resolve the king's question. The king answered and said to Daniel, Thinkest thou indeed that thou canst tell me the dream that I saw and the interpretation thereof? And Daniel made answer before the king, and said, The secret that the king desireth to know, none of the wise men, or the philosophers, diviners, or the soothsayers can declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven that revealeth mysteries, who hath shown to thee, O king Nebuchadnezzar, what is to come to pass in the latter times. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. Thou, O king, didst begin to think in thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter, and he that revealeth mysteries showed thee what shall come to pass. To me also this secret is revealed, not by any wisdom that I have more than all men alive, but that the interpretation might be made manifest to the king, and thou mightest know the thought of thy mind. Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, there was as it were a great statue. This statue, which was great and high, tall of stature, stood before thee, and the look thereof was terrible. The head of this statue was of fine gold, but the breast and the arms of silver, and the belly and thighs of brass, and the legs of iron, the feet part of iron, and part of clay. Thus thou sawest till a stone was cut out of a mountain without hands, and it struck the statue upon the feet thereof, that were of iron and clay, and broke them into pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the golden broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of a summer's thrashing floor, and they were carried away by the wind, and there was no place found for them. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth. This is the dream. We will also tell the interpretation thereof before thee, O king. Thou art a king of kings, and the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, and strength, and power, and glory. And all places wherein the children of men and the beasts of the field do dwell. He hath also given the birds of the air into thy hand, and hath put all things under thy power. Thou therefore art the head of gold. And after thee shall rise up another kingdom, inferior to thee, of silver, and another third, kingdom of brass, which shall rule over all the world. And the fourth kingdom shall be as iron breaketh into pieces, and subdueth all things, so shall that break and destroy all these. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but yet it shall take the origin from the iron, according as thou sawest the iron mixed with the miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay, they shall be mingled indeed together with the seed of man, but they shall not stick fast one to another, as iron cannot be mixed with clay. But in the days of those kingdoms of God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, and his kingdom shall not be delivered up to another people, and it shall break in pieces, and shall consume all these kingdoms, and itself shall stand for ever. According as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and broke in pieces, the clay and the iron and the brass and the silver and the gold, the great God hath shown the king what shall come to pass hereafter, and the dream is true, and the interpretation thereof is faithful. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, and worshipped Daniel, and commanded that they should offer in sacrifice to him victims and incense. And the king spoke to Daniel, and said, Verily your God is the God of gods, and the Lord of kings, and a revealer of hidden things, seeing thou couldst discover the secret. By way of the book of Daniel, here I was reading from the Douay Rheims version of Daniel 2:25-47. This video, The Four Kingdoms and the Apocalypse, is a foray into conceptual history and medieval historiography. The original inspiration came from my reading of the late Reinhard Koselleck's Futures Past, a theorist and conceptual historian who I've been deeply influenced by and would recommend you seek out in English or the original German if you find the translations unidiomatic. Here I've selected and abridged excerpts from Koselleck, together with extracts from DiTomasso's essay on the four kingdoms of Daniel in the early medieval apocalyptic tradition for additional historical context. The Four Kingdoms schema is a historiographic framework that divides the last phase of human history into four periods, each period ruled in turn by a dominant power or world power. Although it originated in classical antiquity, the schema received its enduring formulation in chapters 2 and 7 of the Book of Daniel, where it acquired an apocalyptic valence. There the schema is presented in the form of heavenly revelation, which gave it a predetermined dimension. Both chapters expect the fourth kingdom to be overthrown by the eschatological kingdom of God, thus terminating the sequence. The four kingdoms are never named, but instead are identified symbolically. In chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar dreams of a giant statue that is composed of four metals of descending value: gold, silver, bronze, and iron. In chapter 7, Daniel is shown a vision of the four hybrid beasts that crawl out of the sea, one after the other. The fourth beast is the most terrible of all and has iron teeth. The ambiguity of the images was critical to the schema's enduring significance, since it allowed for latter interpretations in the light of new circumstances. The cardinal issue was the identity of the fourth and final world kingdom. Its overthrow represents the turning point in the divine plan for history that was approaching its foreordained culmination. Equating the fourth kingdom with a present-day kingdom or state enabled a group to locate itself within the sequence of history, thus placing it on the cusp of salvation. This video, of course, predicating its interpretation of the four kingdoms with regards to broader Christendom. The invasion of the principal world city, that of Rome, by the Goths, imposed a unique problem upon the Christians, who had for the past century concerned themselves with inwardly adapting to the Roman Empire. This sudden flood of historical events rendered the Christians apparently responsible for the catastrophe. Paganism had made Rome great, whereas Christianity had brought it down. The Church had assimilated itself to pagan myths, and following the sound ideas of a Eusebius or a Prudentius, had attached the rule of Christ to the persistence of Rome. This situation not only robbed Christians of an easy answer, but also the capture of Rome by barbarians seemed to confirm the accusation. Even Christians saw their Church placed in question because eschatological speculation had focused on the end of Rome. And with the actual end of Rome, the Last Judgment had failed to materialize. Augustine developed his historical theology in opposition to both fronts, and in this way he was able to transcend all previously formulated solutions, so that it might be possible to free Christianity from the charge of responsibility for the fall of Rome. The situational challenge demanded that the rule of Christ and that of an earthly entity such as the Roman Empire be unidentified. His response to the problem was to attempt to demonstrate that peace on earth and the peace of God could not be in any way identical. Thus Augustine developed his doctrine of the two cities, which comprised both church and worldly organization, and which was neither reducible to nor assimilated by them. The empire of gods holds sway over the world and is present in the church. But the inner community of believers is constantly on a pilgrimage, their empire merely built upon hope. By contrast, the worldly empire is based on property. The empires relate asymmetrically to the other. They are not empires founded on opposition, but rather constitute both of them still being entwined within the hierarchical laws of a created cosmic order. A processional occurrence whose certain but chronologically indeterminate demise will lead to the triumph of the Civitas Dei, the city of God. In concrete terms, this meant that the Roman Empire was transcended by the mystic unity of the Civitas Terrena, the city of the world. It is only one, if a particularly splendid and outstanding articulation of sin that rules on earth. The fall of this empire is thus indicative of an unsurpassable meaning, that of the salvation one can find in the city of God, and for which the believer has good cause to hope precisely in the moment of catastrophe. The real answer Augustine gave to the decline of the universal Roman Empire did not play down earthly affliction or involve a flight to the realms of eternity, but was rather an eschatological conception of two realms that were unequally contrary. Theirs was an irreversible, chronological course in both a worldly and spiritual sense towards the Last Judgment. A new eschatological narrative had emerged at the close of the late period of antiquity and into the early medieval centuries. Some of the key early texts here are the Sibylla Tiburtina, the seventh vision of Daniel, and above all the Apocalypse of the Pseudo-methodius. The new narrative was anchored by the figure of the Antichrist, around whom a comprehensive biography gradually developed, including details about his birth, physical features, and activities in this eschatological age. Also prominent were the expectations for a last Roman Empire, the opening of the gates of the north, and the release of the hordes of Gog and Magog, and a series of tribulations and natural disasters that would herald the Last Judgment. These and other expectations were sequenced in the narrative by means of a novel periodizing schemata. Most important was the division of history into 7 millennia, as in the Apocalypse of Pseudo-methodius. The conviction that Rome was the fourth and final world kingdom was reinforced by several factors, including the inertial weight of tradition. Imperial Rome remained fresh in the memory of later generations, in part because of its size and longevity. Augustine of Hippo favoured Jerome's identification of the Fourth Kingdom with Rome, and where Augustine went, many followed. In the medieval memory, Rome was the empire that was essentially a paradigm whose imperial majesty dwarfed the barbarian states that had sprouted up in the former imperial provinces, like weeds in a palace garden that had been abandoned and gone to seed. There was the sense, too, that imperial Rome had absorbed Greece and Greek culture within its vast compass. The Greco-Roman ideal animated a shared Western sensibility that did not and could never extend farther eastwards to include the empires of the ancient Near East. This cultural translatio or transfer also went the other way round, in that Greek civilization was broadcast by virtue of Rome and its empire. As Horace famously wrote, captive Greece took captive her fierce conqueror Rome. This concept was later formalized as the translatio and will prove important to the identity construction in the medieval ages. The post-classical memory of the majesty of imperial Rome was regularly refreshed by the desire to renovate the empire via attempts to reconstitute some of its former parts. That enterprise began with the Emperor Justinian's reconquest of the Italian peninsula in the middle of the 6th century. Justinian, of course, was Roman, since unlike the Western Empire, the Eastern Empire had not collapsed. Its inhabitants continued to refer to themselves as Romans, their empire as the Empire of the Romans, and Constantinople as another seven-hilled city. From the Byzantine standpoint, Constantinople was Rome. It was as if the empire had simply picked up and moved its headquarters east to a better and more secure location. Constantinople had inherited Rome's past, and thus also its place in this eschatological future, this prediction of doom. The conviction that Constantinople was Rome, and that the Eastern Roman Empire was the fourth and final world kingdom, remained at the core of Byzantine political ideology throughout the medieval millennium. However, the seismic events of the 7th and 8th centuries caused the identification of the Fourth Kingdom with Byzantium to become seriously questioned. An early example of the Four Kingdoms schema is that of the 10 sons of the Sibylla Tiburtina. The lost Greek original of this work dates to the end of the 4th century and the early 5th century, and is among the first medieval apocalyptic writings. Study of the Latin versions of this work demonstrates its centrality in Western Europe from the 12th century onward. Another historiographic framework that would later enjoy immense popularity in the West was that of the Three States by the abbot Joachim of Fiore. The Apocalypse of the Pseudo-methodius encapsulates the common medieval apocalyptic tradition in all respects, including its historical eschatological focus and its distinctive eschatological narrative, which it did much to fashion. The text describes the history of the world, beginning with the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden and culminating in the second coming of Christ. This retelling is unremarkable. Revisions of all or parts of the Bible record are as old as the Bible itself. What is extraordinary is the way that its author structured the history of the world into 7 millennia, each millennia corresponding to one day of creation. The underlying presumption based on Scripture is that one day for God is 1,000 years for humanity. The 7,000-year schema did not originate with the Apocalypse of the Pseudo-methodius, but the influence of the work by virtue of its many translations and versions made it the principal vehicle for these schemes' transmission. The Apocalypse's description of the first 6 millennia consists of an idiosyncratic and highly abbreviated retelling of Old Testament history, followed by an account of the Macedonian king Alexander the Great and his successors. Although its author focuses on chronology and genealogy, he never lets the eschatological horizon get too far out of sight. The dawn of the 7th millennium heralds the beginning of the end times, which is structured in this part by the 70-week scheme of Daniel 9. As with all apocalyptic writings, the events of the last days are considered to be foreordained and part of the divine plan. The eschatological curtain rises when the Persians, the Sassanid Empire, are then uprooted by the seed of Ishmael, the Arab Muslims. After causing great devastation and much tribulation, the Ishmaelites are conquered by the last Roman emperor who pacifies the world. This golden time is shattered when the gates of the north open and the hordes of Gog and Magog are released. After their defeat, the Antichrist, the son of perdition, appears. The Roman emperor travels to Golgotha and places his crown on the Holy Cross, which ascends to heaven. The son of perdition enters Jerusalem and performs miracles, deceiving all. He sits in the temple as a god, but is shamed and denounced by Enoch and Elijah. The Apocalypse of the Pseudo-methodius closes with the return of Christ, the destruction of the Antichrist, and the final judgment. Incorporating the concept of the Translatio Imperii, the Holy Roman Empire becomes the extension of Rome as the Fourth Kingdom, seizing the mantle from Byzantium during the reign of Charlemagne. For more information, please see this video on the Holy Roman Empire, linked in the description, where I discuss the specific instance of the Translatio Imperii in more depth. It is from that video that I quote here. As Charlemagne's imperial title was now a fait accompli, later generations would attempt to justify the change by means of the Translatio Imperii, or transfer of rule. As the empire was meant to be universal, so too as a reflection of divine presence and authority on earth, the empire was meant to be eternal with the eternal kingdom, with the eternal city of God. Charlemagne's ascension, therefore, represents the continuation and fulfillment of the enduring idea of Rome, the temporal viceregency of Christ, and not a breach or usurpation. Indeed, any insinuation to the contrary would be akin to blasphemy, and Charlemagne considered his ascension as a renewal of the Roman ideal. The gradual transposition of the Translatio Imperii from east to west culminated in the 12th century. One reason for urgency was the papal schism of 1159 to 1178, which had galvanized the West against incursions from the Byzantines. Another was the investiture controversy, which overshadowed politics throughout the last decade of the 11th century and quickened the development of political identity in the Transalpine states in Germany. One should not overlook either the superlative quality of the men who held the throne during this period, paramount of which are Frederick I Barbarossa and his Sicilian grandson Frederick II, Stupa Mutti, or the Antichrist by his enemies. These were emperors of the mould of Trajan or Marcus Aurelius. The internal vigour in the Western states translated into a newfound sense of identity that was articulated into new emergent ethno-nationalisms. The attitude reveals itself in several works, including that of the Chronicle of Otto of Freising, which was composed in the middle of the 12th century. In his retrospective account of the significance of Charlemagne's reign, Otto directed the Translatio Imperii after Rome and Byzantium to the Holy Roman Empire via Charlemagne. And so Charles transferred the reign of the Romans to the Franks. And it is here, returning to Koselleck, that we talk about the association with the demise of the Holy Roman Empire's eschatological mission with that of the Reformation. In 1528, Duke William IV of Bavaria ordered a series of historical paintings which were to be hung in his newly built summer house. Thematically Christian humanist, they depicted a series of biblical events as well as a series of episodes from classical antiquity. Most well known and celebrated of these paintings is Albrecht Aldorfer's Alexanderschlacht. Aldorfer reveals to us upon a canvas of 1.5 square meters the cosmic panorama of a decisive battle of world historical significance, the Battle of Issus, which, in 333 BC, opened the epoch of Hellenism. Aldorfer was able to portray thousands upon thousands of individual warriors as complete armies. He shows us the clash of armoured squadrons of horse and foot soldiers armed with spears, the victorious line of attack of the Macedonians with Alexander far out at the head, the confusion and disintegration which overtook the Persians, and the expectant bearing of the Greek battle reserves which will then complete the victory. Careful examination of the painting enables us to reconstruct the entire course of the battle. For Aldorfer had in this image delineated a history in both image and narrative. Nevertheless, anachronistically, viewing the painting in the Pinakothek, we think we see before us the last nights of the Emperor Maximilian von Habsburg, or the serf army under Charles V at the Battle of Pavia. From their feet to their turbans, most of the Persians resemble the Turks, who, in the same year the picture was painted, 1529, unsuccessfully laid siege to Vienna. In other words, even Aldorfer captured what was for him at once historical and contemporary. Alexander and Maximilian, for whom Aldorfer had prepared the original drawings, merge in an exemplary manner. The space of historical experience enjoys the profundity of generational unity. Though temporal difference was not arbitrarily eliminated, it was not readily apparent. Aldorfer, who wished to corroborate represented history with statistics by specifying the combatants in 10 numbered columns, has done without one significant number, the year. His battle is contemporary and simultaneously timeless. For a Christian, the victory of Alexander over the Persians signifies the transition from the Second to the Third World Empire, a sequence in which the Holy Roman Empire constitutes the fourth and the last, as inheriting the Translatio Imperii of the original Roman Empire. Heavenly and cosmic forces were participants in such a battle, finding their place in Aldorfer's painting as sun and moon, powers of light and darkness respectively, attributed to the two kings, Alexander and of course his contemporary Maximilian. The sun appears over a ship whose mast assumes the form of a cross. This battle, in which the Persian army was destined for defeat, was no ordinary one. Rather, it was one of the few events between the beginning of the world and its end that also prefigured the fall of the Holy Roman Empire. Analogous events were expected to occur with the coming of the end of the world. Aldorfer's image had, in other words, an eschatological status. The Alexanderschlacht was timeless as the prelude or the archetype of the final struggle between Christ and the Antichrist. Those participating in it were contemporaries of those who lived in expectation of the Last Judgment. Until well into the 16th century, the history of Christianity is a history of expectations, or more exactly, the constant anticipation of the end of the world on the one hand, and the continual deferment of said end on the other. While the intensity of such expectations varied from one situation to another, the prefigured end remained a constant. The mythical investment of the apocalypse could be adapted for a given situation, and even non-canonical prophecies presented little variation from the figures expected to appear at the Last Judgment, such as the Emperor of Peace and the harbingers of the Antichrist, Gog and Magog, who remained confined to the Caucasus or the north by Alexander until the time came for their eruption. However, while the image of the end of the world was varied, the role of the Holy Roman Empire remained a permanent feature. So long as it existed, the final fall was deferred. The emperor was the katechon, that which withholds, of the Antichrist. All of these figures appeared to emerge into historical reality during the age of the Reformation. Luther saw the Antichrist in possession of the Holy Throne, and for him, Rome, in association, was the whore of Babylon. Catholics saw Luther as the Antichrist. Peasant unrest and the growing sectarian militancy of diverse sections of the declining church appeared to foreshadow the last civil war preceding the fall. Finally, the Turks who besieged Vienna in the year of Aldorfer's painting appeared as the unchained minions of Gog. Aldorfer, who had assisted in the expulsion of the Jews from Regensburg and had connections with the astrologer Grunpeck, certainly knew the signs. As a city architect, he applied himself, while working on his painting, to strengthening the fortifications so that they would be secure against the Turks. If we fight off the Turks, said Luther at the time, so is Daniel's prophecy fulfilled, and the final judgment will be at the door. The Reformation, as a movement of religious renewal and revolution, carried with it all the signs of the end of the world. Luther frequently referred to the fact that the fall was to be expected in the coming year, or even in the current one. Yet he added, for the sake of the chosen, God would shorten the final days, towards which the world was speeding, since almost all of the new century had been pressed into the space of 1 decade. And again, one can refer back to the idea of one era, 1 year in humanity, in the Pseudo-methodius, as representing a 1,000th of a year for God, in the sense that the divine schema of the ages is different from humanity's scheme. Luther was speaking of the decade since the Reichstag at Worms, at the end of which the Alexanderschlacht was painted. The foreshortening of time indicated that the end of the world was approaching with greater speed, even if the actual date remained hidden. A ruling principle of the Roman Catholic Church was that all visionaries had to be brought under its ultimate control. Proclaiming a vision of the future presupposed that it had received the authorization of the Church, and this was confirmed during the time of Luther at the Fifth Lateran Council, which concluded in 1517. The ban on the Joachimite theory of the Third Empire, referenced earlier, the fate of Joan of Arc, whose determined affirmation of an unlicensed vision led to her burning at the stake, the death by fire of Savonarola, all serve as examples of the fate awaiting prophets whose visions were post-biblical in character. The stability of the Church was not to be endangered. Its unity, like the existence of the empire itself, was a guarantee of order until the end of the world came. Correspondingly, the future of the world and its end were part of the history of the Church. Newly inflamed prophets necessarily exposed themselves to verdicts of heresy. The Church utilized the imminent but future end of the world as a means of stabilization, finding an equilibrium between the threat of the end on the one hand and the hopes of parousia on the other. The unknown eschaton, that essentially which is the doom and from which the term eschatological derives, must be understood as one of the Church's integrating factors, enabling its self-constitution as a world and as an institution. The Church itself was eschatological. But the moment that the figures of the Apocalypse are applied to concrete events or instances, the eschatology suddenly has disintegrating effects. The end of the world is only an integrating factor so long as its political historical meaning remains indeterminate, imprecise. The Church integrates the future as the possible end of the world within its organization of time. It is not placed at the end point of time in a strictly linear fashion. The end of time can be experienced only because it has already been sublimated into the Church. The history of the Church remains the history of salvation so long as this condition is held. All of these most basic assumptions, this tradition, was destroyed by the Reformation. Neither church nor worldly powers were capable of containing the energies of Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin, which they unleashed upon the European world. In his old age, Luther himself doubted the possibility of peace. Imperial assemblies laboured in vain, and he prayed that the final day would come, asking only that it would not be too soon, that there be a little time. The task of the empire in postponing the end of the world echoes through the plea of a man who saw no way out of this world. Essentially, the empire had failed in its duty. Shortly after, in 1555, the religious peace of Augsburg was signed, so that this praiseworthy nation be secured against ever-threatening ruin. The statelets of the Holy Roman Empire agreed that a stable, secure, unconditional, and eternally lasting peace was to be created. This was to hold, even, and while disputed, this was conclusive, the religious parties should arrive at no settlement and find no unity. Henceforth, peace and religious duty were no longer identical. Peace meant that the fronts of religious and civil war were to be shut down, frozen in situ. Today we can only, with great difficulty, gain a sense of quite how monstrous this imposition seemed at the time. The compromise born of necessity concealed itself with a new principle, that of politics, which was to set itself in motion through the following centuries. Politicians were concerned about the temporal, no longer with the eternal, as the orthodox among all parties complained. Heresy no longer existed within religion, it was found in the state. In 1590, however, its meaning consisted in formulating orthodoxy as a question set in terms of the jurisdiction of the state. Caius regio, eius religio is an early formula of the sovereignty of individual rulers, whatever their confessional tendency, over the religious parties within their domains. But it was only after the 30 Years' War had worn down the Germans that they were able to make the principle of religious indifference the basis of a peace. Primarily began as a religious war by the statelets of the Holy Roman Empire, the 30 Years' War ended with the peace negotiations of the sovereigns, the status to which the territorial rulers had emancipated themselves. While in the West, modern states arose from civil war, the religious war in Germany transformed itself thanks to the intervention or war between states, whose outcome paradoxically gave new life to the Holy Roman Empire, simply as an instrument of peace. The renewed life under the new conditions, of course, the peace decrees of Münster and Osnabrück, had validity up until the French Revolution, as a basis of toleration. What consequence did the new arrangement of politics and religion have for the construction of the modern apprehension of time and the displacement of the future? What had this process brought with it? The experience won in a century of bloody struggles was above all that the religious wars had not heralded the final judgment, at least not in the direct manner which had been envisaged in the medieval period. Rather, peace became possible only when religious potential was used up or exhausted, that is, at the point where it was possible to restrict or neutralize it politically, again using that word, politics. And this disclosed a new and uncertain future. With the paling of the presentiments of the end, the Holy Roman Empire had lost its eschatological function in a manner distinct from the medieval period. Since the Peace of Westphalia, it had become clear, at the very least, that the preservation of peace had become the business of the European system of states. Baudin here played a role as historian, which was quite as path-breaking as his foundation of the concept of sovereignty. In separating sacral, human, and natural history, Baudin transformed the question of the end of the world into a problem of astronomy and mathematics. The end of the world became a datum within the cosmos, and eschatology was forced into a specially prepared aspect of natural history. Working within a Kabbalistic tradition, Baudin considered it quite possible that this world would end only after a cycle of 50,000 years. The Holy Roman Empire was thus stripped of any sacred task. Human history, considered as such, had no goal, according to Baudin, but rather was a domain of probability and prudence. The maintenance of peace was the task of the state, not the mission of an empire which had now become a misnomer. The genesis of the absolutist state is accompanied by a sporadic struggle against all manner of religious and political predictions. The state enforced a monopoly on the control of the future by suppressing apocalyptic and astrological readings of the future. In doing so, it assumed a function of the old church for anti-church objectives. Henry VIII, Edward VI, and Elizabeth I of England all prescribed in strong terms any prediction of this nature. Disobedient prophets could expect lifelong imprisonment. Henry III of France and Cardinal Richelieu followed the English example so that they could stop, once and for all, a steady stream of religious presentments. It is possible to say that a rigorous form of politics, secular politics, divorced from any sacred function, had succeeded in gradually eliminating from the domain of administrative consideration and decision-making the robust religious expectations of the future that have flourished after the decline of the Church, the afterlife of the medieval period. This was most apparent in England, where during the Puritan Revolution the old expectations were expressed in prophetic terms, were once again made prevalent after the regicide of Charles I. But this last great predictive struggle was conducted on a political plane in 1650 and over the question of whether or not a restoration of the monarchy would likely occur. The Republican astrologer Lilly proved that his Cavalier enemies had falsely quoted from their sources, and if Cromwell made his intentions for the coming year popularly available in the form of an almanac, this was to be attributed more to his cold realism than to any genuine belief in revelations. The last widespread millennial prophecy in Germany arose during the 30 Years' War, Holzhauer's commentaries on the Apocalypse, which gave the world only a few decades more. As for the Alexanderschlacht, Napoleon carried the picture off to Paris in 1800, first destined for the Louvre until he hung it in his bathroom at the Château de Saint-Cloud, a fact discovered when the Prussians occupied the Parisian suburb in 1814. The Alexanderschlacht was his favourite painting, and he wanted it in his inner sanctum. Did he sense the way in which the history of the Occident was present in this painting? Is it possible that Napoleon saw himself as a parallel to the great Alexander, and more? The power of tradition was so strong that a long-lost salvational historical task of the Holy Roman Empire shimmered through the supposedly new beginning of the 1789 revolution, where politics had once again been sublimated to the role of ideology. And indeed, was it through the person of Napoleon that this new historical awakening shimmered, who had heralded the definitive end of the Holy Roman Empire, only to marry the daughter of the last emperor and proclaim his son the King of Rome? The transition from medieval and modern in the conceptual realm corresponds to the failure of the Four Kingdoms concept, the translatio imperii, to bring about the fifth kingdom, the kingdom of God in a literal sense. By contrast, the 17th and 18th centuries can be classified as the era of prudence, with religious warfare exchanged for wars of succession, wars of property. This represented a crisis in Christianity, following the fragmentation of the universal church, yet it did not herald the end of, but rather displaced, a sense of religious fervour, extremes driven underground to mutate and fester, to ultimately re-emerge as Jacobinism. Through the advent of Year Zero, a prerequisite of the revolutionary age, the acceleration of time, by that I mean the onslaught of events, and the end of history, any such progressive and linear conceptions of history represent a transmutation, dare I say subversion, of Daniel's original prophecy. The most farcical iteration of this lies in the succession of economic systems integral to Marxist methodology: the gold, primitive communism; the silver, slavery; the bronze, feudalism; the iron, capitalism; and the kingdom of God, socialism, communism, a 19th century secular conception of the four kingdoms. Indeed, as the era of doctrinaire economic Marxism has been superseded by neo-Gramscianism and environmentalism, today's eschaton, or prophesied doom, no longer represents the positive vision of the kingdom of God, or even that of an earthly utopia, as expected in the 19th century, but the negative vision of climate catastrophe. Can we not say that the nation-state represents a new catacomb, that which is preventing the unification of man under one benevolent state, ostensibly the ultimate and sole deliverance from a world consumed by hellfire? Such warranted speculation should only confirm the enduring relevance of Daniel's original prophecy, in whatever form.